Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of 3 reps from the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And hello, Representative Peter Conlon from Addison 2. So glad you can join the show today.
Good morning, Olga. Good morning, Emily.
Good morning.
And as a little public announcement break, I realized the other day that so often we talk about where reps are from, but I don't think anyone knows like what Addison 2 means or Bennington 3 or anything like that.
No.
So for Peter's district, those are the towns or partial towns of Cornwall, Salisbury, Leicester, Ripton, and Goshen. Did I get those all right?
For those of us, Peter, who might not know where any of those towns might be in our lovely state, could you tell us that part too?
Yes, think of a southern horseshoe around the town of Middlebury. And that is more or less what we're talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you. So over on the western side of the state.
The land of milk and honey, yes.
Well, Peter, thank you for joining us. Peter is the chair of the House Education Committee, and he's going to talk to us today about a couple bills. The first one being H-483, which I believe has just passed out of the House and gone to the Senate. And it is, sorry, Peter, yes?
I was going to say, yes, that's correct. It's now in the Senate.
Wonderful. And it's basically providing a process for determining whether or not a private or independent school can receive public funds. So for a student who maybe lives in a town that does not operate its own high school, that student can be tuitioned from that town to a private school nearby. Tell us, Peter, I know Vermont has a long tradition of what is called kind of school choice or tuitioning out, I've also heard it called. And I'm curious, why do we have that tradition, for starters? And then second part of that question, why are we looking at a bill like H-483 now?
Sure. So Vermont has had a long tradition in rural areas of what we've called the town tuition program, which basically, as you said, if a town doesn't operate a school, they can have a town tuition program where students may attend a school of their choice as long as they are an approved independent school, which is a specific designation that the state has, soon to be called an approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition. This is it's a program that's been around for, close to 200 years, mostly centered around our historic academies. And by those, you think of things like St. Johnsbury Academy, Burton Academy, Thetford Academy. At one time, the BFAs up in St. Albans and Fairfax, Linden Institute, but has sort of expanded as one. Some of our areas have had lower population, and they've had to close schools and decided to go to choice. There have been a few just recently, just in my neck of the woods. We've got Hancock and Granville, Rochester. I think Tunbridge and Chelsea may have also closed high schools. And you can either send your kids to an in-district high school, or you can choose to go with choice. So it's something that has sort of grown over the years through necessity, but also through sort of voters' decisions. At the same time, we've had a little bit of a growth industry in independent schools as folks who have wanted to sort of organize smaller independent schools, maybe around a specific mission or vision, saw that they could populate those kids with taxpayer-funded students as a way to be economically viable. And so we've had a number of those grow as well.
I think
this issue, go right ahead.
I think when folks aren't like deeply mixed into this system, I just want to sort of give some framing about the way it works in Vermont, slightly different than other places. How loud is the wood chipper on the road in front of me? You can't hear it? Great. Okay.
Yeah, not hearing it.
Great. I think in other states, when we talk about school choice, it's often a district has both a public school and school choice, and people can choose between the public school and the various private schools. And it often happens on a much sort of larger level than it happens in Vermont. I think because of the funny way this has evolved, with some districts really never having had a public high school, we have sort of communities that are choice communities and communities that are public school communities. And very rarely do we have a mix, except for in instances like, I think Marlboro, actually right up the road from me, is a good example, where they do actually have two high schools that are fairly close by, but they technically don't operate their own high school. And so they've chosen choice. But I think generally it's sort of areas with no high school, with no public high school or no public middle school at all that have choice. And I think that changes a little bit of the context that we entered this next sort of phase of decision making with.
Yeah. And I would just say in those towns, to add a little more context, if you sort of take all the kids who have choice, most of them either go to a public school or one of those historic academies. And then, the rest are sort of spread across a number of smaller independent schools. So this came up as a topic for a number of reasons. One, it's sort of been simmering out there for a while, but at the same time, we had this decision, a U.S. Supreme Court decision come down called Carson v. Macon, which said that essentially it was a Maine case. Maine has a tuitioning system not dissimilar to ours. And they said that, no state is required to have choice, but if you do, you cannot discriminate with those dollars against religious schools. That led to a directive from the Agency of Education that said, if you're a town that offers choice and a family wants to go to an approved independent school that is also religious, you need to fund that tuition.
But Peter,
yes.
Our Montpelier Happy Hour listeners, or our very loyal Montpelier Happy Hour listeners, were recently, in August, had the opportunity to hear Olga and I read the Vermont State Constitution.
Yes, we did.
And so those very extra avid listeners might be aware of sort of a funny kink in this Agency of Education ruling. And I wondered if you could share with us about that.
Yes. I mean, what this really set up was a very complex constitutional conflict. We have the U.S. Supreme Court saying if a family in a choice town wants to go to an approved independent school that is religious, you have to send the tuition. Meanwhile, our state constitution has the compelled support clause, which says that essentially you can't be compelled to support one particular religion or another. And so you've got the U.S. Supreme Court essentially telling Vermont, you have to do something that is contrary to our own constitution. Now, in the hierarchy of who's got more power, the U.S. Supreme Court trumps the Vermont Constitution. So that has set up this conflict. And so there have been a number of bills introduced to address it, one of which got a lot of publicity, which would essentially say, something, no more independent schools. If you are a community with choice, you can choose a public school in Vermont, or you can choose one of the 4 historic academies, which were sort of redefined as public in the bill, but would remain independent. So we looked at that. That seemed a little bit of a major change to the field as it is. And but as we sort of continued down this path, looking at the Supreme Court decision, looking at these bills, we did learn a lot about our independent school system, those that receive public dollars, and felt that there was room to make some adjustments to make sure taxpayer dollars are well spent, that schools are not discriminating or using selective admissions against publicly funded students, and and also the system sort of evolved where it was like a voucher where, hey, you could take that money to, another country if you wanted and spend it there. And sort of felt like that's not really what the purpose of the town tuition program was from the start. So the committee crafted its own bill to address a lot of this. Also, a lot of what we have in there supports what has gone on in the rulemaking process, not to get too deep here, but there's a lot of parallels between the two, and one sort of supports the work of the other. The rules are developed by the State Board of Education, and we wanted to make sure their work was well supported in statute.
How does the State Board of Education, Peter, intersect with the legislative process and then with the Agency of Education?
Well, when we pass laws, laws often have to then be implemented or interpreted to develop rules around them. And so every sort of agency in the administration, so if you think of, human services, education, natural resources, they have the power to make rules. And the Agency of Education is a little bit different in that it also has a state board, which is, been in existence forever. Its role is really moved largely into rulemaking as a result of it becoming less independent as it did when we were a Department of Education, and they hired the secretary. Now the secretary is a member of the cabinet. Anyway, the rulemaking process in the Agency of Education largely is a cooperative effort between the secretary and the State Board of Education, but the State Board of Education really taking on the lion's share of rulemaking, and especially when it came to independent schools.
And then we have this funny process in Vermont which I think
existing process,
okay. Which I think extra exacerbates the compelled support clause, right? Is that we have this statewide education fund that pays for all these districts' very local decisions that districts absolutely have the right to make locally. And so some districts are paying for each independent school, each student going to an independent school or a private school, they are paying what's called the average announced tuition, but some are paying whatever that student needs to fully attend a school. And so that's a funny mix that's like plays into the whole thing too.
Before just to make that a little concrete, I think what I'm hearing you say, Emily, is that the state might say, okay, it costs, I'm just picking out numbers for easy math. It might cost $10,000 to educate a student in Vermont. But there might be an independent school that's the tuition's $15,000. And so the state fund is paying that extra $5,000 to that independent school.
It's a little more confusing than that. So, local districts can spend whatever they want essentially at their own public schools for their own public education, as long as the voters of that district vote for that. And then voters in towns that don't operate schools can either choose to pay the cost, the average announced tuition, which is essentially is sort of a complicated formula that I'm not going to get into, but essentially it's what the state says is sort of a reasonable tuition. They can either vote to pay that on behalf of all students who are being tuitioned somewhere else, or they can pay essentially whatever the requested cost from that student is to attend any school. And the whole town sort of votes on following one scheme or another, but then that full cost is carried by those local taxpayers, but also by the statewide education fund. And I don't know if I'm sort of sending us off on a tangent. It's just like an addition. I'm saying that as an additional reminder about how what often feels like local choices are in fact choices that are carried by the full state and all Vermonters.
I think it's fair to say that when a town decides to spend more, they're generally falling within a range that is not far from the announced tuition. So, and it really happens when you've got a town or a group of towns that all send their kids essentially to the same independent school, often a historic academy. They may say, well, we're charging, $19,000. The average announced tuition is $18,000. Therefore, each town has to vote to pay the extra amount. Otherwise, it is up to the private payer to pay the difference. So if you want to take the money, send your kid to Deerfield, at $80,000 a year, you're not going to get any more than the average announced tuition.
And there are all kinds of like pros and so there's certainly discomfort on Vermont taxpayers paying $80,000 for a student to attend private school in Sweden or Deerfield. But there's also, I think, I at least have some discomfort that some students can use the average announced tuition and as a way of supplementing dollars that their parents pay and then attend any school they want. Whereas other students have in that same district with that same tax base are very limited in their choices because of the average announced tuition. And so like, that's just sort of part of the wild mix. And it's something that the sort of the four academies, the historic academies navigate differently. There's also, Peter, more level setting. So why are some schools called historic academies? Some schools are called independent schools. And then people generally in like normal land say private schools.
Well, let's just say for the purposes of the bill and the areas that we've been talking about, what we are talking about is, and this is the term we'll use all the time, an approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition. So the historic academies fall within that. So does any other independent school in Vermont that meets certain criteria. At this point, probably the most significant criteria is compliance with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act, which says that you will not discriminate against students and their admission based on the typical protected classes, gender, age, creed, religion, all of that. And then we have a Fair Employment Act that is similar to that as well. So in order to be an approved independent school, you have to abide by those non-discrimination rules. H483 adds in some pretty strict limits on selective admission for publicly funded students. And I'm trying to think of some of the other things that stand out. Oh, and these are also within rule. But the other thing is that we had a special education law passed back in 2018, which is also taking effect July 1st this year. And that is if you're going to be an independent school eligible to receive public tuition, and a school district says your school is also the best place for this special education student, you have to be ready and willing to accept that student. That's the law. And so therefore, I think a lot of smaller independent schools may be rethinking their participation in the program, because this is a requirement separate and apart from H483, that if you want to take public dollars, then you have to be willing to take a special education student if the local school district says that that's the best place for that student.
Mm-hmm. That was one question I had when I was reviewing the bill, going back to the application process. Could you provide a little more context? Because when I was reading the bill, it sounded like the independent schools needed to waive or have different application process for a student receiving public funds. But I wasn't quite sure if that was your intent. I just didn't understand that.
Yes, that's very much the intent of the bill, is to say that if the student is being funded by taxpayer dollars and the school wants to be eligible to receive those public dollars, it essentially says, no more sort of good fit admissions. In other words, it says you really can't judge a student based on their academic record, their attitude. But to say, if you want to accept public dollars and publicly tuitioned students, then you need to accept them as a public school would. What sort of we've heard about and read about, even some schools have it on their website, is they like to create a certain culture in their school, and they like a student who's a good fit for that culture. I think we're talking about some very well-meaning places, but the end result can be that students who are publicly funded are perhaps not welcomed at a certain school, or sort of made to feel that they're not the right fit. And this bill would eliminate that selective admissions process.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Hey, Peter.
Yes.
I was talking to some friends last week about this bill, but also just sort of about independent schools in general. And we started talking about dress codes. And I wonder if that is, and sort of some of the classism that becomes quite implicit in dress codes. And I wondered if that's something that your committee looked at when you were looking at what discrimination means in the context of independent schools.
We did not go that far down. We really just looked at the admissions process. Yeah. No, there are required uniforms at some of our approved independent schools, which have to be paid for by the folks attending.
Mm-hmm. So the one concern I had looking at this bill, and this is just based on my experience as a student who did not thrive in public school, and my mom went so far as getting a job at an independent school so that I could go there, so that we could afford the tuition there, basically. And so I just need to ask this question. Do we run the risk, if there are students who are currently at a school, public, private, whatever, or a private school, are we running the risk, and they're thriving there, are we running the risk that they are going to be pulled out of the community in which they're thriving?
Nothing in the bill applies to students who are currently attending a school, right, Peter?
Correct.
Cool. So we're not messing with anyone's existing experience, right? And so, yeah.
Well, I mean, because that is a concern.
No,
I mean, education is so personal, and who thrives in one school may or may not thrive in another. So yeah, I had fears of little children.
Yes, nobody's going to be pulled away from their school under this bill, and that's certainly not the intention. But it is to sort of make the broader statement that most kids attend a public school, and that really, I think it was a little bit of a message of support of our public school system, and to say, rather than dividing everybody up into camps and say this little school is better for this style of student and this is better for that, that what we really need are thriving, robust public schools where students who have difficulties need to have those difficulties addressed in a way that is better than saying, well, why don't you go someplace else? That's really what we're trying to get across here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. We have just about 5 minutes. What else, before we head to break, what else do you think is key for folks to understand?
Well, it does not limit anybody's choice of any independent school that wants to be eligible to receive public tuition. It has very strong anti-discrimination language, but that exists in rule as well. And that, part of what this bill does, in addition to what we've talked about, is it tries to be really responsible to taxpayers. We've had it's a relatively unregulated, I don't want to say industry, but system, in that, a lot of independent schools, they don't open their books. We don't really know how all of those public dollars are being used. Many of them are vast majority publicly funded students. Some of them charge different rates for public students versus private students. And so we need to make sure that taxpayers aren't paying more than any other student. We need to make sure that taxpayer dollars aren't being used to subsidize private pay students. So it has some limited safeguards in that respect without being highly intrusive on the operation of independent schools.
Thank you. Emily, what would you like to add?
I think Peter has been summarizing this bill many times over for quite a while now, and summarized it well. I think it's been an interesting debate to be a part of from sort of the periphery, in that, Wyndham Southeast, where I live, has had really strong public schools for everyone for a long time. And the community really invests in that and believes in that and votes for our school budgets. And then to see sort of and we happen to have a lot of private schools in our area that mostly have out-of-state kids going to them. And so, a lot of constituents who work at independent schools or private schools and really believe in them and, what they can do for kids. And I think one of the things that was interesting about this debate and sort of the story, the story behind some of this legislation is what happens when we've had this sort of historically evolving system here in Vermont, very similar to what they have in Maine. And that runs up against a national far right push about school choice. And how, when those two things come together, it makes for some very strange bedfellows. And it was interesting to see both how like coalitions form and reform, what talking points on the floor look like in that context, sort of where funding comes from in various points in this debate. And so that's been a really interesting part of it too. I was also just heartened to have so many constituents write to me about how much they cared about our public schools and our public dollars through this process. And so I appreciated that.
Thank you. Well, Emily Kornheiser, Peter Conlon, we will be back in just a moment after we hear from some of our underwriters here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser from Brattleboro, as well as Representative Peter Conlon, who is the chair of the House Education Committee. And we were talking in the first half of the show about H483, and now we're going to move on to school construction. But before we do that, Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, respectively, and not the station, nor their employers, friends, neighbors, pets.
Thank you. So, Peter, H486, which is the school construction bill, has passed out of the House and has moved on to the Senate. What was some of the intent behind creating a bill just around school construction?
So this bill has two main parts. The first half was really focused on school construction and was really inspired by the work of the state of Rhode Island, which has a similar history to Vermont, where they had a state-funded school construction program that ended, sort of went into a moratorium, and then restarted in a very thoughtful way. Vermont, similarly, until about 2008, often funded 30% of a major school construction project, whether that was building a new school or a major renovation on an older school. But those dollars essentially maxed out in 2008, and there's been a moratorium on that 30% ever since. So school projects since then have really been largely funded through the state education fund without the sort of separate input of dedicated state dollars. Meanwhile, we've been going through a period for as long as I've been around of deferring maintenance on our buildings so that we can fund programs, teachers, the more education focused things. But the chickens have really come home to roost, and we've got a lot of schools in, frankly, pretty rough shape that need tens of millions of dollars worth of repairs. So this school construction bill, people always get mad at us when we say it sets up a task force, but this does in fact set up a task force.
It's a really good task force, though.
Well, and Emily and I have served on two task forces together now that actually produced good results. So I'm sort of pro task force. Anyway, it will set up a task force that will itself set up a state commission whose job it will be to direct state dollars for school construction and look at the needs across the state. How do we prioritize it? How do we have equity in how we provide state dollars? And it's going to be a good and thoughtful process. We are very lucky that we've got some good models out there between Massachusetts and Rhode Island to look at. And we've got sort of a new philosophy within our state treasurer's office that says our state not only has the capacity to expand its borrowing capacity, but actually needs to. Because if we want to attract people to our state, one thing we need to have are thriving public schools. So that's what this does. It sets up a task force that, with a lot of expertise on it. That task force would create a state level commission whose job it would be to look at what is a currently underway assessment of all of our school facilities and help communities address the needs as best as possible.
So before we go to the second half, before we go to the second half of the bill,
please,
very important. I just want to sort of accentuate some of the existing inequities in how school construction is paid for now. So again, we have this statewide education fund that everyone pays into that pays for all school budgets. But those school budgets have to be voted on at the local level, as does any bonding decisions by communities in order to engage in school construction. And voting up or down a bond or voting up or down a budget often is not actually about the sort of absolute taxes that community members will pay, but is much more about sort of the culture of that town's sort of sense of fiscal conservatism or not fiscal conservatism, whether or not like that community is prioritizing, fields over septic, all kinds of wild things, who just shows up to vote on that. And so
that's probably the biggest one, actually.
Yeah. And so many communities have passed bonds in these years. Those bonds that those communities pass are then essentially sort of in some ways carried just by that town, but in other ways carried by the statewide education fund and all Vermont taxpayers. So we're already all paying for school construction dollars at schools, but that opportunity is certainly not spread equally or equitably across the state. And we do, as Peter said, have some communities that are, as actually the vice chair of the education committee said, I think, what did she say? One flush from, how did she phrase it?
One flush away from needing to close their school.
Yes.
Wow.
And it's just like our students deserve more, and our teachers deserve more, our communities deserve more. And then we've also, so before Peter gets to the next point, which is a very important second half of the bill, there's also air quality, which is something that we've all been thinking and talking a lot more about over these last years. That's part of this conversation too. So second half of the bill, Peter.
Well, I guess I would add on to what you just said is that, we have learned so much more about air quality, natural light, and how these things really have an impact on students' learning, that this will hopefully help us address that in many of our schools as we come up with a plan and move forward. Now, the second half of the bill puts a pause on a program that started a year ago to test all of our schools for airborne PCBs. These are cancer-causing airborne particles that existed in construction materials used between this, 1960 and 1980, basically. And of course, were most notably found in the Burlington High School when they were about to do a major renovation project. They were doing routine testing that takes place before a major renovation, found levels that exceeded the state safe levels, and ended up having to close their school, move their kids to the Macy's department store downtown, and they are now going to bulldoze the school and build new. That testing program was implemented in a rather hurried way in 2021. It was a piece of legislation that didn't really deserve the thoughtful deliberation that the General Assembly is generally known for. And, it was sort of created without looking at the implications. If you look at the implication of Burlington High School, when they tested, they closed their school and have to build a new one to the tune of $190 million. We don't know how many Burlington high schools are out there, or even just, a whole series of $1 million needs. The challenge with PCB testing First of all, Vermont is the first in the nation to take this on in all of its schools. And when I say all of its schools, I mean public schools, independent schools eligible to receive public dollars, and even private schools, as we think of private schools, many of them that don't even serve that many Vermonters. Anyway, the concern is that as we look at a bigger, thoughtful approach to school construction, anytime a school gets tested for PCBs, and their level is at a certain level that requires immediate action, we are setting up a scenario where we could be throwing good money after bad. Maybe you are having to replace all the caulking in 3 walls of a building because there's PCBs there. That has to be done immediately. Meanwhile, that school was basically scheduled to be scrapped in 5 years, and we're investing millions of dollars in it.
So in a series of public meetings over the fall, and then in my own committee or joint hearings with Peter's committee, I kept on asking, so the PCB testing is being led by the Agency of Natural Resources, and the school construction study is being led by the Agency of Education. And I kept on asking, perhaps you could deliver us an integrated report, or perhaps you could integrate your recommendations, or perhaps when you look at the cost of school construction, you could integrate the cost of PCBs into it, or the opposite, because of this exact concern that you're fixing caulking on a window that you're going to remove. Even forget even just scrapping the whole school. It could even be as simple as replacing windows. And over again, I was told the way you all, incredibly frustrating legislative body, have set this up, you have not allowed us to integrate that. Now, I think there's a little bit of a grain of salt here, but taking those folks at their word who have been moving forward with timelines on various reports that we asked them to move forward on, I really appreciate this opportunity to step back and say, okay, maybe we made a little bit of a mistake in the way we were aligning these two things, and we need to actually make sure we're doing this well and have the right people at the table to integrate all of these findings and to make decisions about what's best for Vermont kids moving forward.
Yeah. And this pause is really to assign to the same task force that I talked about previously the job of being much more deliberative and, as Emily said, coordinating the two issues together into one thing, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is kind of barreling ahead with this testing. And every time results come in, all of a sudden results have to be dealt with. I think I just heard last week that maybe one of the schools in the Wilmington area had some elevated levels, and we'll need to be addressing them. And that's a major disruption. And one thing that I don't think we need in our schools right now, after the past 3 years, is major disruptions.
And so I think there's ways to hear this that it sounds like we're all cool with poisoning kids in the interest of efficiency. And so I want to respond to that idea that no one has said out loud in this room yet. Which is,
but probably someone is thinking, yes.
I mean, I think I would think if I heard us. So I think the really good example is Cabot, but there are other examples where the testing levels, it's sort of, you're doing airborne testing. And so those concentration levels change really considerably depending on if the heat is on, if windows are open, if people have been in the school or not been in the school, which doors have been open or not been open. And so a whole school could be disrupted because there are PCB levels in a closet that no one goes into. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the school is actually perfectly safe, for instance. Or in the case of one school where the testing levels when the whole school was shut down over the summer and it was tested were very, very high. But once the building was actually being used again, it was at completely safe levels. And so what is the intervention that a responsible superintendent or principal makes in that instance? And how is it compared to sort of what the Agency of Education might be recommending, or we might have set in place in statute? So it's not a cut and dry issue as it might sound.
Mm-hmm. And I'll even go to a higher level and say that, I think that the science around what is a safe level, what's your, what ages can be for what safe level, how much time you spend in a school, that science is, I would call it, not completely settled. And there's I guess a bigger and broader debate about the risks we live with every day, and the risk of closing a school or closing a big portion of a school, versus keeping kids in their schools. Obviously the situation in Burlington was hopefully an outlier, but it was highly, highly disruptive to those students who had to basically create a new place to go to school.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
well, as I understand with Burlington too, there were some other issues with the school that maybe had left it a little outdated. That may have fed into the final decision.
Yes.
Sorry, Emily, you were saying?
no, it's okay. I was going to make Gen X jokes about going to school in a mall, but I don't think anyone who lives in Burlington finds those funny. So, make the joke. Oh, Olga has frozen.
Sure, I would have.
You froze. Would you like to
Yes,
say that again?
I said as a fellow Gen Xer, I would have found that funny. So
We're not.
you're always free to make Gen X.
There are a lot of
jokes
Gen
around
Xers
me.
in Burlington who I have found don't find those jokes funny. So I am going to just not make them.
Oh dear.
And I don't know if I would if my kid had been like being schooled underground in totally inadequate facilities for years.
There is that.
Yeah.
There is that. So one thing that I find exciting about this bill is that, as someone who has sat in on many a school board meeting and many a town meeting, a select board meeting, delayed maintenance is so easy to do because when it's sitting, when the cost of replacing a roof or replacing a septic system is sitting right in front of you, it seems like such an easy way to save money by not doing it. And then, of course, many years down the line, what was a 1 million fix is now a 5 million fix. So I find this exciting and proactive as someone who has watched many town budgets increase over the years because of delayed maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, when you're talking to your friends in the legislature, because delayed maintenance is such a knee-jerk reaction, have you received pushback? Has there been anything like, why do we need to do this now? Or
I think the bill addresses a lot of long-standing discomfort around inequities in our school finance system. So, last year when we were having all of these debates about people waiting, the examples that were often used about the results of the way our education finance system was set up were about actually delayed maintenance on school buildings. That was sort of the extreme example of what an underfunded school looks like. And so the argument for this bill was really made last session, and I think is just really quite incredible. I think there's also something to be said for having the right people at the table for these conversations. So, especially in some of our smaller school districts, you might, or even our larger school districts, you don't have a construction specialist or a school hygiene specialist or an air quality specialist or an energy efficiency specialist, right? And so this task force, and the task force then setting up a board, is going to make sure that the right people are at the table to be examining these issues, so that it does sort of move off of the knee-jerk reactions or the easy fixes or the sexy fixes or whatever it is, to really be thinking quite broadly about what do schools need to look like for our communities, what is safe, what is a conducive learning environment. I think about the school in Bellows Falls High School. That was part of this big national trend for schools without walls, right? No indoor walls in the school so everyone can learn together. And basically like and so many schools all across the country were built this way. And then almost every school that did it within a few years was like, oh my gosh, this is a terrible idea. It's so loud in here. I can't think. No one can think. No one can focus. And they fixed that. The Bellows Falls school still doesn't have walls.
Yeah. Yep.
And I would say that, a couple things. One is that we have sort of over time with all of our deferred maintenance lost what should be a very high standard for what we want in a public school. And so we just sort of look at our schools and accept them for as they are. But you can go to some states where they spend good money on their school facilities, and all of a sudden you get a much different perspective. And you think, our students, our communities deserve better than what we have accepted. And it's time to really address that. And the other thing is that we run with local control here, but what we don't have is a lot of available expertise, as Emily was saying. And so the Rhode Island model with the commission is they're actually sitting at the table side by side with school boards saying, hey, here's what's possible. Here's what you should look at, and helping them navigate this path.
Emily, you look like you wanted to say something.
I was just, there was one person that was named to this task force from, I'm trying to even remember what it was, Peter, the Association of American Hygiene. What was it again?
Yeah, like something like hygiene
Love
specialists. Yes, but they are well known for their air quality work and other environmental hazard work.
Which is so important in a school because, they can be a little.
They can be dry, they can be stuffy. And I think, legislators, more than even most people, know what it means to work in an environment where there's no air circulation. And
yes, we essentially spend our time in a large elementary school in classrooms all day long.
It's a very fancy elementary school, but it has terrible air quality and not enough windows.
Yes.
What else about this? So it sounds like, sorry, I want to circle back. It sounds like the task force about it has kind of already been outlined, if not formally set up, but it's been outlined. What are some of the other roles that are on the task force? You mentioned the hygiene person.
Yeah, so you'd have 4 legislators, 2 from the Senate, 2 from the House, because ultimately this will come down to some politics in terms of money and all of that. Folks in the world of bonding, so from the Treasurer's Office and the Municipal Bond Bank. Folks from the areas that kind of represent the people who are inside the building, superintendents, school boards, principals, teachers. And then people who are experts in the area of school construction, school maintenance, areas like that. I'm not sure if I'm leaving anything out, Emily.
I can't think of, that's all the folks that I'm thinking of, and I don't have the bill, but that's the basic layout. And it's also, it's nice because legislators are minority on the task force. This is a project that's really being done in deep partnership with the Treasurer's Office.
And it's the model you mentioned has been based on what Rhode Island has been doing. Is Rhode Island far enough ahead in what the work it's been doing to start seeing results or any lessons learned?
They have built a number of schools from the ground up and continue to work with communities to not only build new schools, but to renovate older schools. And it was not without some political will on their part, because they are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in school construction. But yeah, I mean, I think that they sort of learned the pluses and minuses from the Massachusetts program. We will hopefully learn from the pluses and minuses of the Rhode Island program. So it's really nice to have a couple of neighboring states or nearby states ahead of us on this process.
And one thing I really appreciated that we heard from the folks from Rhode Island is that school construction needs to be a mix of those sort of deep infrastructure issues around air quality or septic or whatever, and facade improvement and entryway improvement. And, as part of my endless series of part-time jobs and consulting gigs, I do work with our school district here in Windham Southeast around school attendance policies. And a huge part of that is about the welcoming environment for the school, how welcome and comfortable families feel coming in, how welcome and comfortable and safe kids feel. And so much of that is wrapped up in, is this a place that honors and respects me when I walk in? Is this a place that I feel welcomed and supported? Is this a place that feels familiar and part of my neighborhood? And so much of that it's in facade, it's in entryway, it's in spaces where parents can mingle and linger when they drop their kids off at school so they can form a school community that goes beyond the children. And that stuff is really just as important as air quality and septic, but I think we often leave it out when we're cutting corners and trying to sort of save money on a bond.
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes back to what we were talking about in the first half is, how do students find a community they can thrive in, which the building, this is me with my feng shui hat on, but the building is crucial to that for all the reasons Emily just mentioned.
To a certain extent, we've forgotten that as we've deferred maintenance, and we've got, great teachers and some great programs. But, even in my little town, the school is, let's just say, less than ideal, despite being considered a nice school. And yeah, I think, what we heard from the Rhode Island folks and their philosophy was, really, they basically said, if you're just going to chase energy efficiency and renovations to sort of try to keep up with your deferred maintenance, then you're always going to be behind. And that you really need to be moving into, essentially making a school that celebrates the community and a place that voters will be excited about seeing built and funding.
Great. Thank you. We are just about out of time. Anything else about H486 that we want to mention before we end the show?
I would just say with both the bills we've discussed today that they are only halfway through their legislative journey, and they are now in the Senate, and the Senate will also do their deliberative work on it and make changes as they see fit.
And so if any of our listeners are interested in those bills' journey, they can reach out to their senators and give an ask to check in on how those bills are making their way through.
Wonderful. And as always, you can also check the legislative website because it's a pretty good bill tracking forum there as well. Process. Okay, Peter, if anyone wants to learn more about you, where can they go for more information?
Well, there's also, in addition to the bill tracking website, there's also the legislator tracking website there. So you can always just use that. And then I have a campaign website, which is conlonforhouse.com. But frankly, you can just Google my name and you can probably learn more than you ever want to know about me. But I'm not a famous and wealthy record producer, unlike other people who share my name.
Shucks, right?
Yeah.
Emily, how about you?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and you'll find links to all the social media, my blog, sign up for my newsletter, find out what's happening, be in touch.
And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour can be found on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2, as well as thanks to BCTV, Brattleboro Community Television. You can find us on their website as well as many PEG stations around the state. And of course, wherever you find your podcasts, you can subscribe to us there. We will be back next week. Have a good weekend, everyone.